We have a distinguished group of people with us today, and what I want to do is just take about a minute or so and summarize what you probably heard if you were able to go to the sessions tonight. You've heard about the federal government that's come in and how money is no longer going to Telecom, money is going to broadband. So that's an important step, and that transition is in the midst of it. You've also probably heard a little bit about the experiments that are going on about how they're going to change the Connect America program so that they can get money to those areas. You've probably heard a little bit about the history of where we spent the money for those. And I've been involved in this now for a number of years, both from a commercial side in a Fortune 50 company, down to startups, to actually being the consultant that helped put the Dept program together and the money going out. And so when I look at all these changes that are happening, what is different today is we're being interrupted by people that are actually putting broadband in rural America. And they're doing it because they are doing it with a different approach. What I would say is the most important part of this is we're trying to solve a multiple equation problem, right? It's different if I'm in Maine. It's different if I'm in Arizona. It's different if I'm in Texas or Iowa, my home state of Virginia. I live in the second richest county in the United States. I get broadband of 10 megs to my house with FiOS for $24 a month. My chief engineering guy lives in Lewellen County, the second richest county in the United States. He's on satellite. We're separated by about 15 miles. Those guys come in to the Holiday Inn Express and the Canaras, a local library, to be able to do their work because the commute's too tough. So whether you're in the farthest parts of the area in Texas, or you're here, or you're in town in those other areas that we're looking at, you still need broadband because it drives our economy. It drives our quality of life. So the other thing we just had in this last panel is they were talking about, well, where are the success stories? And you've heard how each one of those have adapted. So rule number 2, I think that you have to apply a network and figure out the revenue streams associated to the community that you're trying to develop, because it's very different. Third rule is, and this is probably the most important one, as the financial guy, when I go out to raise money for these different groups, I get the people that live in urban areas, one, to just not understand why there isn't broadband there. And if people wanted broadband, they would just buy it, right? So I always tell them, the chances of me getting somebody to adopt broadband increases exponentially if they actually have a network that works. So access counts where you live and where you want to use it. The program that we're trying to put together today is identify that. One of the hardest ones is on the farm. I started out as a home builder, grew up in that business, and my first job out of college was with Purdue Chickens over in Salisbury, Maryland, and on the Eastern Shore. I was amazed what I learned when I found out that farmers are actually have money. 2, they spend it wisely, and that they need it for how they drive their business. It's just that they're spread out, right? And so what we did with this panel was start to take some of those and look at there's another revenue stream. The reason that I got Mark on the panel for us from Deere that you're going to talk about is that there's 9 devices for every person, right? 9 devices for every person. And if I think about telemedicine, I think about utilities, I think about farm equipment, I think about security systems, I think about cameras, I think about smartphones. What we need to do is change and recognize that there are more revenue streams out in each one of those if there is an access network for them to get to, if there is a middle mile network that it will collect the data in that local area and come back. And that's what this panel is going to talk about. So let's go through this a little bit. We started out with the question when we got these gentlemen together, and we said, why should we care if broadband is the farm of rural America? So we're going to bring the people that are actually there, that are responsible for those programs, and look at it to tell you why it's important. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on 2 states, because I think examples are excellent. We're going to talk about Texas, and you're going to hear a little bit about the top priorities in the rural parts and the urban parts and why it's important for the state. And obviously, as Jane pointed out, it's important to all of us because we all seem to like to eat, and we seem to like to drive our cars, right? And we seem to like the materials, the raw materials that are out there. And some of us like to go out and actually play and fish and do those areas. That would be me. Now, the other part of this is there are commercial people that are out there. I would tell you that when I go and look at an area, I'm interested not only in the homes that are there, I'm also interested in all the service trucks that go out. So if I'm in a poultry area, there's a lot of trucks that go out there. If I'm somebody that's a service person doing electric, the electric trucks are out there. If I'm public safety, there's a mobile unit there. So there's a combination of two revenue streams, portable and fixed. And if we think about those are important elements, and you'll hear that a little bit. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how do you actually get that network out there and use part of those, and some of the winning strategies, and the foundation that was laid in the last 3 years by where we spent money in USDA, Dept, and Dept, right? Those areas have created pathways now if we can take advantage of those. So that's really what we're going to do. We're going to have each guy's got 3 slides. He's going to tell you the top 2 or 3 things that is important that we would like for you to know. And then we're going to open it, I'm going to have 2 questions, and then we're going to open it up to you people, and then you can ask some questions, and we'll be very happy to answer yours. So who's participating with us? We're going to start with Dan. He is the Assistant Commissioner for Texas. He's got a very interesting story to tell you about it. We got Phillip Brown, who is interested in telling you a little bit about Iowa and their program and the political side for that we're getting at. And then we got Mark Lewellen from Deere Tractor, and he's going to be able to tell you a little bit about the commercial things that they do. So let's hang on for our next shot. Let's start with Texas.
Great. Thank you very much, Keith. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. Welcome to Austin. Welcome to Texas. We're glad that you're here, and hopefully we can provide you a few insights on how we operate as far as with regards to Texas and how important connectivity and broadband is to us within the state of Texas. Real quickly, let me give you a quick overview of the Department of Agriculture in the state of Texas, and then also some of the different things that we do, as well as a little bit of insight on how agriculture is critically important to the state. The first thing that I would impress upon you is the number 2. And that is because in Texas, the number 2 economy in the state of Texas is agriculture, right behind oil and gas. And if oil and gas prices go much lower, then we may be back to number 1 again. But the one thing about it is that we continue to be the stable part of the economy. As we look at the cross-section within Texas and how important agriculture is it is credited with 1 in every 7 jobs in the state of Texas. So you can figure that everything that we do in the rural areas is critically important, not only to the state, but also to the urban areas as well as it is to the rural areas that we serve. Now, to give you an overview of some of the things that we're involved in and within the Texas Department of Agriculture, really the Department of Agriculture is somewhat of a misnomer when you start looking at the different things that we touch and different things that we're involved in. First of all, of course, yes, we do a lot of things on the farm. We do quite a few things with regards to agriculture stakeholders, whether they be landowners, whether they be actual producers, or whether they be the communities that they reside in. So you get beyond the different marketing programs, the different things that we do with regards to trying to help move Texas products into not only U.S. markets across the United States, but also across the world, and especially when you consider that we are the number 1 exporter in the United States for several different commodities, including cotton and beef and multitudes of other things, as well as within the Department of Agriculture. Once you move out of your typical agriculture titles, we also come under, or things that come under our umbrella are the State Office of Rural Health Care. So all those small rural hospitals out there across the state of Texas are overseen by the folks within our office. In addition to that, all the community block grants that come down from the federal government to these small communities to help them put in infrastructure, to help them put in, whether it be a water system or a new communication system in some of their cities. We actually administer all those community block grants, as well as all of the food and nutrition programs except for 2. So all your school lunch programs, all those things you talk about, feeding children and things like that, also come under our umbrella. So we touch folks not only within the rural communities, but also quite often, and more so as far as numbers are concerned, in the urban areas. One of the biggest challenges we face, and I think that this is critically important as to why we need the broadband market in Texas to be expanded even further, is that, you know, you hear this all the time, that, you know, Texas is a big place. You know, if you think about it, we have such a diverse economy within agriculture. I mean, all the way from the Gulf Coast, where we have multitudes of different crops going on, including aquaculture, all the way down to the valley, where you have fruits and vegetable production, all the way up to the high plains, which is where most of your grains and cotton, all the way to East Texas, which include the timber production, as well as all the different livestock production we have across the state, including, you know, cattle and sheep. You know, we're the largest wool and mohair exporter in the country. You know, in addition to that, we also are a very large dairy producer. So we employ not only numbers of people in the rural communities, but also in those processing plants, whether it be a cheese processing plant, or whether it be a yarn plant, or someone that's in the export communities down on the port of Houston. So we touch a lot of different lives. One of our biggest challenges that we face is making sure that our people are able to be competitive that are out there producing in those rural areas. And because we have such a geographic difference in addition to a marketing difference, we always have something growing in the state. Whether it's in South Texas all the way up to the Panhandle, we really don't have any downtime in our agricultural production. So some of our challenges is to address not only the different times of year that people are actively involved in their production and processing, but also to be able to make sure that they able to get those things to market, sell them productively as well. One of the three, and on your slide up here, you see we've had the 3 Ps are critical with regards to connectivity and broadband. Production, needless to say, you're going to hear some from the Deere folks with regards to how important production is. We see this in Iowa. You know how important the mechanics are tied to our broadband connectivity. Performance. We often hear from our, right now we're in the middle of our legislative session in Texas. Fortunately, we only meet every other year for about 6 months, so that's a good part about it. But they also try and jam everything they can into it. So we often hear from our urban legislators, why do we need rural health care? Why do we need to fund rural health care? Why can't they just drive to the nearest hospital? Well, if you wanted to say that from where I grew up, you know, the nearest place for me to buy a gallon of milk was 15 miles away. The nearest place for me to go shopping at a grocery store was 45 miles away. The nearest major hospital of any sort was over 100 miles away. So you just don't hop in the car and go. Therefore, some of these rural healthcare centers, some of these rural hospitals are critically important. And the case I make to our urban legislators is that think of it kind of like insurance. You may not want to fund the rural hospital, but be out there on a fishing trip or a hunting trip. Be out driving somewhere between Midland and El Paso and have a healthcare emergency. You're going to be pretty happy that you have rural healthcare in these areas. So that's, you know, one of our challenges that we face, just like everyone else in the rural areas, is that our population is decreasing, but our importance is increasing. You know, when you're a border state like we are, we have issues not only related to all the production activities, the rural healthcare activities, and profitability, which is our 3rd P here, but we also have those issues related to border security and our ability to be able to track not only what's coming across, you know, because we're in charge of all the disease and pest management and all those things that are coming across the border. Our ability to react quickly to those depends upon our connectivity. And that's how critically important broadband is to us. It's not just about the production side. It's about the performance side, it's about the profitability side. And without it, you know, we continue to fall further and further behind in some of these rural areas. So one of the things that I stress to you is knowing how important we do understand how important connectivity is to our rural areas, because it impacts not only those people that are directly involved, but in the case of a state like Texas, it's important to the #2 economy within the state. Anyway, Keith, I'll stop right there. I know we've got a lot of other folks going to visit.
think he talked on all these different parts. The one thing I would say that he didn't mention, it's really a truism because it kind of relates to me personally. I grew up in a very small town in West Virginia. I actually was born in the Midwest, Wisconsin, and grew up in West Virginia. And I left because I couldn't find a job when I graduated. And what we've talked about for economic development is you keep 10% of the students that move to an urban area in the other area with it, you'd have a dramatic impact in the employment and the tax base and the productivity of these other areas with it. And in every one of those things, I would just add that one other piece with that. It's great. So agriculture matters. Now I think the second state that we wanted to look at was really Iowa. And what we're going to talk about here is probably a very progressive state that has a very ambitious program. And we're going to have you talk a little bit about that. Just tell me when you want me to flip the slide for you.
Great, thank you, Keith. That's right. I've been working for the last 5 years through the State Broadband Initiatives funded program for the state of Iowa, through Connect Iowa. I've also had the privilege of working with the Connect Texas program, which is our program, similar the equivalent here in Texas. And I think the reason we're talking about Iowa today is because the state over the last 2 legislative sessions has had a very intense desire to find some sort of bipartisan consensus legislation that would expand the state's activity surrounding broadband policy. The primary goal is to drive broadband deployment at faster than entry-level speeds into the state's rural areas. And in this last iteration, the focus of that push has been, I think, heavily pointed towards enabling agriculture, ensuring that the ag sector in Iowa has the connectivity it needs to really embrace the potential of the Internet of Things. Before I dive into sort of framing these challenges, and I don't really want to read this slide to you since you can see it, but make a couple points. We were talking about connectivity in rural areas, and it made me think of the place I grew up, which was a rural county, and we lived in town, and the library was a block away. That was great for me. Most of my friends didn't. They lived 10, 15 miles outside the population center of the county, and so back then, we were coming into town, they were coming into town to do research through the card catalog. Today, it might be that they need to go into town because they need to get an internet connection. And when it's 7 o'clock at night, and you've got 2 or 3 kids, and your high schooler says, "Hey Dad, I gotta go to town because I need to get online," that throws a pretty big wrench in your night. I mean, I have a high school sophomore. He has a one-to-one device program in his school, so all of his books, all of his work are done on his iPad, and that's great. But I cannot imagine how much of a pain it would be if, while we're trying to do dinner and bath, I've also got to figure out when I'm going to get him to some location that has a hotspot so that he can do his schoolwork, which is, sometimes hours and hours a night. So that connectivity, not just for the ag sector, but also just for things like education, connectivity at home is, I think, critical. So to frame some of these challenges, the first thing I've got up there, this huge rural divide at the national benchmark speed. You might recall in January, the FCC adopted a new national benchmark speed, a new goal for ubiquitous broadband availability. And that speed threshold is 25 meg down, 3 meg up. And that's quite a bit faster than what we currently consider the official definition of broadband. It's quite a bit faster than the last national benchmark speed, which was 4 down, 1 up. And so when you start to compare availability at these different speed thresholds, what you start to see is a huge difference in availability. And the places in states like Iowa and Texas that don't have 25.3 are large chunks of the states, and they might not represent the largest percentage of population. So Iowa, I've got a couple maps we'll show you in a minute. Just over 74% of households can access 25.3. That roughly 20 or 75% of the households live in less than 9% of the state's geographic area. So you've got 25% of the population that can't get broadband at the national benchmark speed, but they live in roughly 92% of the state. They're spread out. The same holds true here in Texas, where you have 4.9 million households in Texas who can access 25.3, but that roughly 5 million households lives in less than 5% of the state's geographic area. So you've got 4 million households spread out across basically 95% of the state who need access to 25.3. It's a huge challenge. And the next point I would make, rural broadband adoption tends to lag behind the averages. In Iowa, the rural broadband adoption rate is 6 percentage points less than the state average. So you've got a gap in adoption that you need to address as well. Return on investment is a persistent problem that we face as we talk about the challenges of network availability. Even with federal resources, we're seeing some providers walk away from available subsidies simply because even with the federal subsidy, they don't believe that return on investment exists. But I do believe that you need to leverage the federal resources that are available. The Universal Service Fund is $8.5 billion a year. Now, not all of that goes towards network deployment, but again, it's a tool that can't be left on the shelf if you're seeking to drive broadband into these places that are sparsely populated and have availability challenges. There's a key question surrounding platform. In Iowa, if you want to drive deployment of 25.3 to households, you're going to consider things like fiber. But if you're trying to ensure that a tractor can connect to GPS and do precision agriculture, that might be a wireless solution. And so the platform is key, and it might impact the goals. Business broadband adoption rate is 81%, or 82%, I'm sorry. In the ag sector, though, that adoption rate rises to 84%. Telework has grown 6 percentage points in Iowa since 2010. So that's an opportunity for rural households that might not have the ability to drive to an office and work. It provides an opportunity for them to get a job. So there's a huge opportunity, but only if the network is there. And then the transfer of wealth, which Dan touched on and Keith touched on. As younger generations leave their hometown because a job or opportunity isn't available, what happens when their parents pass on? They leave their wealth, their estate to the younger generation that may not live in that small rural town. And if a job isn't in the small town, it isn't in the rural area, and that younger generation has moved away, when that wealth passes on to them, it's likely that it will never come back to rural America. And so the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship has done a lot of work on this. They estimate the transfer of wealth threat over the next 20 years is over $15 trillion. And that's $15 trillion of assets and resources that could leave rural America and simply never return. Let's go on to the next slide, and we'll move quickly through them. This next map shows broadband availability in Iowa at 10 meg down, 1 up. I picked this slide because in December, that's where the FCC set the benchmark for Connect America Fund subsidies. Any company that receives a subsidy to build out broadband in Iowa or across the country has now got to build, in exchange for that subsidy, a network capable of providing 10 down, 1 up. Every dark area is a place that doesn't have access to 10 down, 1 up in Iowa. So it's a pretty big chunk of the state. Now let's move on to the next slide. This is going to show you 25.3. Now, it's a little bit different. Basically, if it's pink, they have 25.3. Now, what you don't see is there are tons of little tiny pink specks. Those represent towns. I haven't dived deep enough in yet to say this for sure, but I'm fairly certain those small towns are places where you've got a rural co-op that has received U.S. subsidies over the last few years, has used those as they rebuilt their exchanges to put in fiber. And so, you've got population centers in the counties, but again, that's 92% of the state's geographic area that doesn't have 25.3. And so when you think about how are you going to incentivize deployment to an area that large, which only has 25% of the state's households, it starts to frame this enormous challenge. And Iowa has looked at different ways. They're trying to use the tax structure, regulatory reform, things like tower siting, as well as deployment grants to get at this challenge. But the amount of resources, frankly, that the state has available makes it unlikely that any deployment grant program they've got is going to be able to make much of a dent in driving 25.3. Let's go to the next slide, the last one, because I wanted to highlight the importance of business and broadband. 81% of Iowa businesses use broadband every single day. That represents $20 billion worth of online revenues last year. But 31% of Iowa businesses today would like faster broadband but can't get it. So business and broadband is critically important to business. It's especially important to rural America and rural Iowa and businesses that want to conduct work. If you want to set up a business in your small town, you have to have this availability. And we already see that there's a problem. There's a gap where 31% would buy faster broadband today if it was available, but it's not.
Thank you very much. One of the things I want to talk about for this one, and then I want to have Mark talk a little bit about Deere. When I do economic analysis for small towns, I recognize that most towns in those areas probably have one or two businesses that drive that town, right? You go to Cedar Rapids, they make oats, right? I go over here, they manufacture something. If I'm a farm, and you talk to a farmer, he has 3 jobs. He farms, he probably does something with his wife on another thing in town, and then he does another little job. So they're part-time people working in jobs, but when you add all those up, there's money. There's 98 million Americans that just happen to live in a town, 100,000 people or less. 98 million Americans, it's 1/3. So then let's wipe out the 100,000 and drop down to 50. There's probably still 50 to 60 million of us that happen to live in those areas. That's a terrible resource not to use, right? If you think about it. The transfer of wealth that he's talking about for those things is tremendous. When we go to these small areas, the first thing we do is we get local investors to put up some money so we can attract urban money. Why? Because we overcome their opposition that nobody cares, nobody really wants it. I would also like to tell you the other part, for every person that lives in an urban area, it's not that they can't make enough money, right? If you go build a network, it's just not enough for the largest corporations because they wish to concentrate in certain areas and have less risk. So for rural America and for farmlands to be able to do it, we need to change the discussion of it and build an appropriate network that meets the needs of the users that are there, both the res, the small biz, the portable, the travel, the machine to machine, right? FirstNet comes up, telehealth is going to add some. Monitoring for activities. One of the questions I'm going to ask him in a little bit, and I'll give him a chance to think about it, is water is a big concern if you're out west, right? That's his number 2 concern that he's got. I just happen to know that when we were looking at networks in Kansas, that the number 1 user of electricity and telecommunication is the water wells. But they can't talk to each other because they're limited to less than 4 megabits. And they were saying, could you get out a network that would allow us to talk to our water pumps and measure the electricity? And we said, if we go build that for you, looks a lot like a school program, right? We go to the key locations. I could serve all those other people that are scattered around there because I've built the backbone of the network. So we need to think about the revenue streams that are available in those, who wants it, and how do I aggregate those together? And those together with private investment and some government funds and some focus on those areas allows us to go build these areas out. I think one of the things that we talked about for Iowa was if you're in an area that has nothing, and you could get 5 or 10 megabits that actually worked, that's wonderful, right? Because then adoption's a whole lot easier. I can actually use it. Tell me later if I'm going to come back and give me 100 gig, because right now I'm going to figure out I'd like to have 10, because it just doesn't work. So think about those for a little bit, and now we're going to turn this over to Mark. And what I would like for him to talk a little bit about is talk about how a corporate Deere tractor thinks about broadband in the areas and how it impacts the farmers. And if you want to expand it to some of the other areas like lumber and some of the other stuff, feel free to go for those as well.
All right. Thank you. My name is Mark Lewellen, and I'm sure you've heard of my company, John Deere, but you probably haven't heard of my job. I'm the radio spectrum manager for John Deere. I'm the first and only one they've ever hired in the 177-year history of the company. So that kind of gives you an idea as to where we're headed. You all know that we make tractors, right? What you probably don't realize is what a high-tech company John Deere has become and the amount of technology. And you're doing what's called variable rate seeding. So you already know, because of what we've told you from the fall production, that some areas of your field have high yield, some not so good yield, and some kind of low yield. So you want to maximize seeds to the maximum extent you can where it's got high yield, and then pull back on those seed layouts where you don't have the yield, because you don't want to waste seed, right? I mean, you guys probably don't realize it, but genetically modified corn seed is like $300 a bushel. So to start putting that out over thousands of acres, it adds up to be a big input cost. So if you can reduce that, that's good things for the farmers. So anyhow, I wanted to kind of give you an idea as to why we're here, why John Deere cares about rural broadband, and what is it that we do with it. So it's on all those machines, and now we'll talk about Iowa specifically. Is that yours? Okay, so I said we started out in 2011. We added this to the construction, to the ag side of the business. So all of those dots on that map represent a successful data-only telephone call through a modem off of one of our machines. Keith mentioned that everyone's got what, nine modems now. I'm not sure I can quite get to there, but
9 devices.
9 devices. Anytime you see one of our machines now, you know the machine's got a modem, right? The person driving the machine almost guarantees has some kind of a smartphone in his or her pocket, and they probably have a tablet on the seat next to them. That's become a very important tool for agriculture as well, even in the lab. It didn't even exist 5 years ago, right? So that's up to 3 already, okay? That's only just one guy and one tractor. He's probably got a couple more tractors, maybe got some sprayers, got combines for the fall, maybe has sensors. We talked about water. We have something called Field Connect, some water sensors and other things. We found out that people tend to overwater because they'll go out and check the topsoil, and if it's dry, they water, even though there may be plenty of water beneath the soil. But if you don't know that, you tend to overwater. So being able to know that for a fact helps with costs and conservation. So as you can see, we're kind of everywhere, right? That's one thing that kind of struck me when I came to work for Deere. I was not hired because of what I know about cows, plows, or sows. Okay, I'm about megahertz, megabits, and spectrum. That's my background. So when people in Iowa were out raising corn and soybeans, I was back east raising antenna farms. My dad's been a ham radio operator since he was like a kid, and I've had my license since I was in junior high school. So the word megahertz is literally within my vocabulary since I was like 5 years old. So that's kind of my background. Anyhow, let me go to our next slide. Did we skip? Did we skip the slide?
It's the ones I got for those.
Uh-oh. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I had an Iowa-specific slide. All right. Anyhow, so the things that we've been trying to do to try to solve this problem is to talk to regulators and FCC and Congress and folks here in Austin, for example. So one of our messages is what he's been saying too, is that from a provider standpoint or from a regulatory standpoint, we can't just think about providing fixed service to people or locations anymore, right? We've got to start thinking about maybe covering modems, covering the number of modems in an area, the number of connections. It's like I'm just going to stop there.
Okay. So I think what you've heard is a story today that maybe is a little different than the one you came in with. I know my perception of the need for broadband in rural areas has changed pretty dramatically over the years. Primarily because as you start to work in these different areas and start to talk to them, there's some truths. They look in some ways very similar to urban areas where they adopt technology. You'll be surprised in the combines and the other parts that they have, they're basically little electronic offices. And those tractors run by GPS and they communicate. They actually check the stock market as they're there doing all their activities. And then the home, where the wife or the children are for those parts, become an important hub for them. Now, one of the statements that I made was there's 9 devices for every person that lives in an area, right? So that doesn't mean that that person has 9 devices. Some people like me probably get pretty close to that when I look at all the things that I have. But when you start thinking about it, it's not only to the people that live there, it's the people that serve those people there. So if I think about the poultry industry, for example, for part of those that we're doing on the Eastern Shore, all the feed trucks go back and forth there every day. The electric power guy goes to repair stuff. The power guys cannot read their meters and the data that comes off of their network where they are because they can't reach those, so they have to send a truck out that pulls up and he downloads his data, and then he goes back and loads it into his super slick system, right? If I'm a John Deere guy, because I asked him when I started thinking about those things, what do you do? And the farmers were like, well, yeah, I can get a connection kind of to my house, but as soon as I get over that little hump, I can't really talk to anybody. So we're talking about how do we extend Wi-Fi or radios over to their tractors. And they've come up with some neat devices that kind of look like a little suitcase that tells you the light goes green when you got a signal, and when you kind of go over a hump, not so much, but you can drive right up a little bit and you're back there and now you're transmitting and doing your things. So they're finding innovative ways to try to do this. The other part that I think was really kind of interesting with this is in the financing part that comes in is people don't want to spend the money, right? And that is absolutely false. I can tell you from all the places that they have money, they're willing to spend it. However, they're a value customer. If you talk to a farmer and you go to some of the rural areas, I can give you two things that you shouldn't do, right? Don't walk up and just start talking business to them. You're automatically not going to get very far. First of all, you walk up and you look them in the eye and you shake their hands and you say hello and you find out how the day's going and you talk about a couple other things and then you work your way into that conversation because they don't do business with people they don't know. I think you mentioned that or one of them mentioned it. I had a great example of that in Pocomoke City where they sent out a flyer for a wireless network that they put up. They gave them $15 a month for broadband. They carpet bombed the city. How many responses do you think you got? How many would say 50%? How many of you would vote for 30%? No takers yet. How many would say 20% response rate of just interest? One guy so far, two guys, right? How many of you would say 15%, which is the national average if you go any place? Still not there. All right. They got no responses. None. Same thing happened in Southside Virginia, where they went through and they had Bristol, Virginia, which is a very famous story about all the stuff that works. They went 2 counties over, did it out. Their football team plays our football team. I don't talk to them. And I'm sure you would hear that in some of these other areas, right? And so that's what you got is you need to, and we talked about in the last panel, there's a thing called trust. The trust has to start from the broadband groups that are trying to do it, to build this adoption rate, back down to the companies, back down to the governments that are there, and you need to build what we call a viable, local, sustainable broadband ecosystem. Now that term came about probably with the FCC broadband plan. And if you do not create an ecosystem, something that changes and matches the needs that are there, it tends to fail. You can't cookie cutter all these areas, right? So I want to now go back and ask one question. I'm going to have each person go through. I gave Dan a head start so he's had a chance to think about it. But what I'd like for you to answer, the first question is how would broadband impact water usage for those? And then I guess think about yours for a second. I'd like one infrastructure kind of comment, thoughts for you on Iowa for yours, and then one from your experience for those, and then we're going to open it up and take questions from the floor.
Real quick, and I think that anywhere in the United States you go today, especially as you look at Western United States, water is a critical issue. In Texas, we face some rather large challenges, not only in agriculture use of water, but use of water across the state of Texas. Very briefly, let me kind of give you some quick background. In Texas, I don't think most people realize that we have essentially in this huge state, we have one natural lake. That means everything else we have to find a way to produce the water to get it to the people in the state, whether it's through surface water, dams, reservoirs, underground water, or groundwater. You know, we have so many different ways that we have to get this. Now, that being said, agriculture is often tagged as the largest user of water in the state, and we are. The question is it 65, is it 75, is it 85%? I think it's up for debate. I think what we use today in water is a lot less than what we were using 5 years ago. It's a whole lot less than what we were using 10 years ago. And it's mainly because of the technological advances that we've been able to make in the usage of water. Now, when I say that, you might say, well, I mean, you know, how much technology can there be involved in water? If we're being charged as being the largest user of water in the state, that means that every one of these other entities out there, mainly large cities, are coming after us saying, look at all that waste that they have out there. They're just using up all of this water. They're flooding their rice fields. They're pouring it all over vegetables. They're just having cows drink and all this. And my first question that when people start saying, well, we just need to cut off all the water that goes to farmers out there. And in the state of Texas, like I said, there's very few opportunities for a person to have the, access without some kind of regulatory control over it. So when they start saying, let's just cut off the water to agriculture, my first question to them is, what do you have against children? What do you have against old people? I kind of get that quiz look, and I said, you realize that we don't feed, fuel, and clothe this nation without agriculture and water. So, that being said, within the last few years, the argument that we're able to make in agriculture is that we are 98% efficient in our irrigation technology today. We're 98% efficient in the water that's going out. Unlike when I was growing up, and if you had irrigation, most of it was a hand-moved pipe that you walked out, and your dad and your brothers and your sisters, moved the pipe every day. Nowadays you have irrigation systems which cover thousands and thousands of acres, which are monitored by everything from groundwater districts to river authorities to the federal government to the state government and everyone else. So we're watched pretty closely on our water usage. And all of our irrigation systems today are mainly tied to some type of remote connection in which we're monitoring not only how much water is going on that field, but how much water is going on particular parts of that field. As was mentioned, when Deere put out tractors which allowed them to adjust the number of seeds being put in the ground, we also know that there are certain parts of the field that require less water, whether it's because of soil type, because of drainage, whatever it might be. So all of these systems are highly monitored and highly computerized, and because of that, the connectivity is critically important to our producers out there, because they have to be able to monitor that usage out there. Otherwise, we do get tagged with being, a wasteful part of the water system. Fortunately, we've been able to adjust our technology. The reality is that we're going to, even though we have a very small percentage of improvement on our irrigation side, we've got to find ways to do that. And the reality is the only way we do it is through our ability to be able to monitor those systems remotely and over a very, very wide area.
Sure. I think I'd like to talk about a couple things quickly. And the first one is just the impact that broadband has on the workforce. One of the things that Connect Nation has been doing is we navigate, what happens, to the programs that were seeded by the federal government through the SBI program. We started looking at jobs and jobs training and focusing on rural areas. We created a program called Digital Works, which trains people to take jobs that they can do from home. A lot of that is call center type work. But what we've discovered is that there's an enormous thirst among the employers of this country for employees who can do that sort of job. And they're willing to bring jobs back to the United States, and there's a willing and able workforce in rural America that would love to have that type of job that they can do from their home. And so having that infrastructure available, I know firsthand today is having an impact on the success of our Digital Works program. And then with regards to education, and so both of these are, we kind of talk about access, adoption, and use in our programs. They both fall under the use, broadband in the economy and broadband in education. I mentioned my sophomore who's got that iPad. One of the classes he takes is Mandarin Chinese. And he's doing really well, and I'm really proud of him because his final exams are 4 tests. It's not just one. It's a challenging course, and he has the opportunity to take Mandarin. But there are kids across the country in rural school districts who don't have that opportunity, either because they don't have an available teacher or they don't have enough kids interested in taking the class. And with virtual classrooms, the potential of things like that and remote learning, really, it's just the physical location of the school building should have no bearing on the quality of education any child in America receives in the 21st century. And so we're looking forward to the day when, with E-rate and other things that are coming across, the federal policies and state policies, we get to the point where every child has the access to a quality education enabled by technology.
All right, thanks, Keith. I already gave you my water story, so I'll have to give you something else. You talked earlier about the wealth transfer effect. I just want to give you an anecdote just from my own personal experience with Deere. I already know several people who the son was only able to come back and take over his father's farm because he could bring his wife's job with him that required a broadband connection to the farmhouse. If that didn't exist, he would not have been able to come back and take over that farm. So I wanted to give you a little more detail as to what kind of technology that we have, and I can argue that it even helps keep families happy during the holidays. So this is a story around Thanksgiving a couple years ago. So one of our dealers was going to head out for Thanksgiving holiday, a road trip with his whole family, and they were going to see his wife's family. So there was no way this trip was not going to happen. So of course he's getting ready to pack up to go on his road trip, and his work phone rings. And one look from his wife says, "You ain't leaving to go to work, no matter what this call is about." But of course, it was one of his biggest, best customers, and he was out trying to do his planting, or not planting, I guess it must have been, I'm not sure what it was doing, Thanksgiving harvest time, right? Had some software update, didn't work right. So anyhow, the solution was, we have a product called RDA, Remote Data Access. So you're familiar with being able to share a computer screen between two people that aren't in the same location. This is the same thing, except this guy was able to call back to his dealer through this RDA technology, broadband connectivity, and work with a dealer to figure out his problem. So the solution was, the wife got in the car, drove on the road trip. Her husband, the Deere dealer, got in the passenger seat, fired up his laptop, logged into his account with RDA, got in touch with the farmer who was in his combine, and worked out the problem while driving down the road. So everybody was happy for Thanksgiving, everybody got to where they were going, everybody got their job done, and there was no discord at all. That's how powerful this technology is.
All right, so you've heard from all these people about things that they've seen, observations, hopefully through our stories and looking at Texas and Iowa. Maybe it's changed part of your perception. Maybe it's confirmed some things that you knew. You guys have any questions that you would like us to try to address for you?
This question is primarily for Mark, but the rest of the panel may want to comment. Could you comment a bit on 3G LTE wireless technology, and if that's adequate for today's needs for your modem technology, and if there are immediate applications where maybe higher bandwidth, high definition video or another technology might be hampering what you're doing?
Great question. One thing is, because of our installed base and the way we kind of do things, we're always going to be behind the leading edge consumer, generations. So for example, last year, 2014, we transitioned from 2G to 3G modems. So that's what's coming off the factory line now. Our plan is within like 3 to 5 years to transition to LTE modems. So that kind of gives you an idea as to where our speed requirements are. We're not speed demons. I would rather trade coverage, or I'd rather trade away speed for coverage. I'd rather have all my acres covered with 1 megabit per second, than have 5% covered at 25. So I would like to have more acres covered. So that kind of maybe gives you an idea as to where we're at for speeds.
And the only thing I would add to what Mark said is 1 megabit's not enough. If you think about streaming video, you need 4. If you have multiple people in a location that's wireless, you need more. I think the FCC standards moved to 10 megabits as a really logical place to get started. That's kind of what a multiple home needs to have and where you need to be for those. So for me, a location could be the service truck, it could be the video camera, it could be the other parts with it, and we ought to think and raise our standards up for that. The standard is rising under the CAF programs to go to about 25 megs. I think if we could get 100 megabits to all these different places, great. But when you've got nothing, or you've got just satellite, getting 5 to 10 that would really work would transform these areas, right? And that creates that first foundation. Our lawyers that we have is a really great guy, and he always has this one saying. It says, "Stop talking about stealing third till you're on first base." So I think if we set a goal and we looked at it and said we could cover the rural areas and put 10 megabits at every house and have portable locations for those, you would see a dramatic impact in the quality of life and services. And then for those areas that need more, we'll figure out how to get more there.
One quick thing I'd add to, in our scenario here, probably the most important areas that we need faster speeds is in rural healthcare. And we have telemedicine and all those things where where doctors can communicate with major regional or state hospitals with regards to care. But what we're finding in rural areas is, of course, that these rural hospitals we're losing. they're closing. And so a great deal of that critical care may end up being a paramedic out on a farm or a ranch needing to connectivity and being able to communicate with a doctor in Dallas or Houston or whatever. So those are certainly areas that it's critically important that we get that speed.
So I think we got time for one more question. I just want to put one other thing. NOVA right now, which is the Northern Virginia hospital group, has perfected taking the emergency room out via telemedicine to rural hospitals, which dramatically lowers their cost, and there are other parts of it.
So when I think about the costs of a fiber deployment, I realize that the biggest line item is going to be burying things in the ground. Now, it seems to me that farmers are pretty good at burying things. Have people looked at sweat equity and barn raising type activities as a way of reducing deployment costs?
I think all of those are in there. I would dissuade you for one thing. I'll give you an example. I started a program for Eastern Shore of Virginia, which we're building a network on. Originally, it was $40 million to build out fiber to the home to everybody. Nobody would fund it. They gave them through the BTOP program $10 million. The state added $3 million. We built a middle mile network that connected all the schools and ran through, but the people couldn't use it. So they went again this year now, a decade later, it's cost them $40 million just to build out to those other areas. Nobody wants to put the money in. We're building now a network for about $3 million that's delivering 5 to 10 to 20 megabits to all those home areas for about 3.5. So I think there's this combination. You got to figure out what you want to do, and one trick doesn't work for everyone. You got to figure out who's there, get the coverage, and then start to build up for part of those.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention this. You know, in Iowa, they have a statewide fiber network, and it provides broadband service to government, to schools, you know, and clients like that. And the state last year actually issued an RFP to solicit bids for someone to come in and take over that fiber network. They received one bid, and it was low enough that the state turned it down. So, you know, it's an interesting wrinkle in that state because they have a fiber network, and they're not quite sure what to do with it. And so it's one thing that certainly colors every conversation when you talk about deployment there.
So I have to close this out now so Jane doesn't throw things at me. We do want to thank you for coming. I'd like you, if you could give a little applause to the panel for their activity. Someone will be available to take your questions and answer stuff for you, and we look forward to moving on. Thank you.
And I remind everyone that we are planning to put these up on our website, our Rural Telecom, and also remind you that there is this